In the humid darkness of the Central Highlands, sometime in late 1965, a squad of Vietcong guerrillas gathered around a prize. It was a heavy, olive-drab box, still warm from the body of the American radio man who had carried it. An N/PRC 25, though they did not know its designation. To them, it was a voice, the enemy's voice. They had overrun a small American patrol in a chaotic, close-quarters ambush. 4 Americans were dead, and the rest had melted back into the jungle, calling for support that arrived, as always, too late. The Viet Cong squad leader, a man hardened by a decade of war, saw the radio not just as a trophy, but as a key, a weapon more valuable than the captured M16 rifles. With this, they could listen. They could anticipate. They could learn the enemy's plans, his movements, his fears. They could turn his greatest strength, his ability to coordinate, into his fatal weakness. This box of wires and transistors, they believed, would allow them to set the perfect ambush, to strike with foreknowledge, to be ghosts who knew the future. They were wrong. What they didn't know, as they fiddled with the knobs and listened to the hiss of the static, was that they had not captured a weapon. They had captured a testament. They were about to receive a lesson, not in battlefield tactics, but in the brutal, soul-crushing arithmetic of modern industrial warfare. This radio would not whisper secrets of American patrols. It would scream the truth of an enemy so vast, so powerful, and so profligate with its resources that it defied their entire understanding of conflict. The voice they were about to hear was not the voice of a few soldiers in the jungle. It was the voice of a factory. It was the voice of a nation. It was the voice of their own doom. The strategic doctrine of the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong was built on a foundation of scarcity, patience, and unwavering ideological resolve. General Vo Nguyen Giap, the architect of their strategy, envisioned a people's war. It was a war of the flea against the elephant. The flea, he reasoned, could not kill the elephant with a single bite, but it could bite and jump and bite again until the great beast was maddened, infected, and bled dry. Their strength was their connection to the land, their ability to disappear into the population, and their mastery of logistics born from desperation. Their great logistical artery was the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This was not a road, but a complex web of footpaths, tunnels, and river crossings stretching over 12,000 miles from the north, through the jungles of Laos and Cambodia, and into South Vietnam. Along this trail, an army of porters, many of them women and children, carried the war on their backs. Ammunition, rice, medicine, everything moved at the speed of a human being. A porter might carry a 60-pound bag of rice, walking for months through terrain of unimaginable difficulty, stalked by disease, snakes, and the constant threat of American bombers. Bicycles were reinforced to carry hundreds of pounds of supplies, pushed by hand up muddy slopes. A single mortar round arriving at a forward position near Key Sand might represent the culmination of a 3-month journey and the labor of dozens of people. Theirs was a war waged with human sweat, blood, and an almost spiritual endurance. They believed this moral and physical toughness was their ultimate weapon. They believed the Americans, with their soft bodies and weaker minds, could never match this level of sacrifice. They saw the American soldier as a temporary occupier, counting the days until his tour ended. They, on the other hand, were fighting for their home, and they were prepared to fight for 1,000 years. Their propaganda reinforced this. It depicted Americans as clumsy giants, easily baffled by the jungle, dependent on their machines, and lacking the will to fight a protracted war. Ho Chi Minh had famously told the French, "You can kill 10 of my men for every one I kill of yours. But even at those odds, you will lose and I will win." This was the core of their belief system. They could triumph over material. That ideology was a stronger weapon than steel. The American philosophy was the precise opposite. It was a philosophy born on the assembly lines of Detroit and in the research laboratories of California. It was a belief that what was a finite resource, but steel was not. It was a conviction that human life was precious and should not be squandered in grueling marches when a machine could do the work. The central icon of this new philosophy was not a determined soldier, but a machine, the Bell UH-1 Iroquois helicopter, universally known as the Huey. The Huey was more than an aircraft. It was the physical manifestation of America's industrial and technological dominance. It allowed the U.S. military to treat the jungle not as an obstacle, but as an inconvenience. The brutal terrain of Vietnam, which cost the Vietcong so much in time and blood to traverse, could be crossed by a Huey in minutes. A company of soldiers could be lifted from a secure base and inserted directly into a remote landing zone, arriving fresh and fully supplied. Wounded men could be evacuated from the battlefield and be on an operating table within the golden hour, dramatically increasing their chances of survival. This concept, air mobility, was a revolution. It was war waged at the speed of a turbine engine, fueled by an endless river of petroleum. It was a strategy that sought to replace human endurance with mechanical horsepower, to substitute logistics for sacrifice. Where the Viet Cong saw a 10-mile march through mountains, the Americans saw a 15-minute flight. Where the Viet Cong saw the need for a month-long supply effort, the Americans saw a request to be filled by the afternoon. They were not fighting the same war. They were not even operating in the same century. Back in the jungle, the Viet Cong squad's radio operator finally found a live frequency. He pressed the handset to his ear, his comrades leaning in, expectant. They were hoping to hear a nervous platoon leader giving away his position, a brief, coded message that could be deciphered. Instead, they were hit by a tidal wave of noise. It was a cacophony, a storm of overlapping voices, spoken in a strange, fast-paced jargon. It was not the sound of a small, isolated patrol. It was the sound of an ecosystem. Dust off, this is Bravo 6. We have 2 urgent wounded. Repeat, 2 urgent. Landing zone is hot. I say again, LZ is hot. Pop smoke. Over before that transmission even finished, another voice cut in on a different net. Gunsmoke 3-1. This is Lancer 2-2. I need a fire mission, danger close. Grid coordinate X-ray Tango 197 456. Enemy in the tree line 200 meters west. Fire for effect. Over then another. A pilot's comm drawl. Okay, Sidewinder, I see your smoke. Rolling in hot from the north. Watch yourselves, and another, mundane and utterly baffling. Red Dog, this is the command post. The general wants to know if the ice cream made it on the last bird. Over ice cream. The squad leader stared at his radio operator, whose eyes were wide with a confusion that was rapidly turning to dread. This was not the sound of a few lost soldiers. This was the sound of a swarm. The radio revealed an enemy that was not only everywhere at once, but could summon thunder from the sky with a few spoken words. They were calling for medical helicopters as casually as a man might call for a taxi. They were coordinating artillery strikes from miles away with terrifying precision. They were discussing resupply, air support, and troop movements simultaneously on multiple channels, a web of communication so dense and complex it was incomprehensible. The Viet Cong had runners. It could take hours, even days, for a message to get from a forward unit to headquarters. The Americans had this. This box that connected a single soldier in a ditch to artillery batteries, to fighter jets, to supply depots, to command centers, all in real time. The initial thrill of their capture curdled into a chilling realization. They were not fleas biting an elephant. They were fleas trying to bite a creature made of lightning and steel. The radio wasn't a window into the enemy's plans. It was a loudspeaker broadcasting the sheer, overwhelming, impossible scale of the machine they were fighting. And for the first time, in the suffocating quiet of the jungle, they felt truly, deeply alone. The box in their hands was the IN/PRC-25, a backpack-sized FM radio that became the workhorse of American communications in Vietnam. It weighed 235 pounds with its battery. It had 920 possible channels. It was, in military parlance, man-portable. The United States manufactured and shipped over 130,000 of them to Southeast Asia. There were enough of these radios in Vietnam for every single American platoon to have several, with thousands more held by artillery observers, air controllers, and support staff. This single piece of technology represented a communications network of staggering density. The Vietcong and NVA relied on a system that had not fundamentally changed in centuries. Runners carrying messages, and in rare, high-level instances, cumbersome landline telephones that were constantly being cut. The PRC-25 gave a 20-year-old American lieutenant the ability to speak directly, instantly, to a B-52 bomber crew flying at 30,000 feet, to a battery of 155mm howitzers 10 miles away, or to a naval destroyer in the South China Sea. It was the nervous system of the American war machine. The numbers told a story of a conflict between two different worlds. And the story began with the Huey. Of the roughly 16,000 helicopters built, over 7,000 saw service in Vietnam. In 1968 alone, U.S. Army helicopters flew over 33 million sorties. They moved men and material with an efficiency that bordered on the magical. A standard slick UH-1D could carry a squad of 9 fully equipped infantrymen at over 120 miles per hour. An entire battalion of 800 men could be lifted from their base and set down on a hostile hilltop in a matter of an hour. The NVA, by contrast, measured its movements in weeks and months. To move a division from North Vietnam to the south via the Ho Chi Minh Trail was a 6-month ordeal. The Americans could move a division from Kentucky to Vietnam in a matter of days. Then there was the firepower the radios summoned. The casual call for a fire mission unleashed a destructive force that defied belief. A single battery of 6 105mm M101 howitzers could fire over 60 high-explosive shells per minute, plastering a target area the size of a football field with shrapnel. During the course of the war, the United States expended over 140 million artillery shells in Vietnam. That is more than the entire U.S. Army fired during all of World War II. And that was just the artillery. The real terror came from the sky. A forward air controller, flying a tiny Cessna, one bird dog, could use his own radio to direct a flight of F-4 Phantoms onto a target. Each Phantom could carry up to 18,000 pounds of munitions, a payload greater than that of a World War II-era B-17 Flying Fortress. They delivered napalm, cluster bombs, and high-explosive ordnance with pinpoint accuracy. The ultimate expression of this air power was Operation Arclight. This was the code name for missions flown by B-52 Stratofortress bombers. Flying in cells of 3, too high to be seen or heard from the ground, they could saturate a box, an area 1 kilometer wide and 3 kilometers long, with up to 90 tons of bombs. The explosions would arrive without warning, a rolling thunder that tore the jungle apart, ripped trees from the earth, and vaporized everything within the target zone. From 1965 to 1973, B-52s flew over 126,000 sorties. The total tonnage of bombs dropped by the United States on Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia exceeded 76 million tons. That is more than triple the 21 million tons dropped by the Allied powers in all theaters during the Second World War. This immense destructive power was sustained by a logistical chain of unprecedented scale. The American war was a war of consumption. The U.S. military built massive, deep-water ports at places like Cam Ranh Bay and Da Nang, creating instant cities of warehouses, fuel depots, and airfields. These ports could handle thousands of tons of supplies every single day. The numbers are difficult to comprehend. The average American soldier in the field required an estimated 50 pounds of supplies per day to keep him in the fight. His NVA counterpart subsisted on perhaps 2 pounds of rice. In a single year, the American military machine in Vietnam consumed 45 billion gallons of petroleum products, oil, gasoline, and jet fuel. They fired over 200 billion rounds of small arms ammunition. They consumed billions of sea rations, millions of gallons of insect repellent, and millions of pairs of jungle boots. The American way of war was not just to defeat the enemy, but to bury him under an avalanche of manufactured goods. The radio chatter about ice cream was not a joke. It was a profound strategic statement. It spoke of an army so well supplied, so confident in its logistical dominance, that it could afford to fly frozen luxuries into the middle of a war zone. This was a level of material superiority that rendered traditional concepts of bravery and sacrifice almost irrelevant. The Viet Cong were waging a war of will. The Americans were waging a war of industrial output. And the numbers whispered and shouted over the captured radio made it terrifyingly clear which side had the advantage. The statistical avalanche was one thing. Its human impact was another. The dawning realization of this material gap was not a single event, but a series of profound shocks experienced by individual North Vietnamese and Viet Cong soldiers, from the lowest rifleman to the highest-ranking pilot. Their diaries, letters, and post-war memoirs tell a consistent story of disbelief turning to a grim, professional respect, and finally, to a kind of fatalism. Nguyen Van Hung was a porter on the Ho Chi Minh Trail for 3 years. In a post-war interview, he described the journey south. "We walked at night, never in the day. We carried everything. A bag of rice on the back, a mortar tube on the shoulder. Many got sick with malaria. We ate cold rice mixed with river water. Some days we ate nothing. We were always hungry. We saw the bombs from the B-52s. The ground would shake even many kilometers away. We knew that one bomb could destroy more than a whole company of porters could carry in a month. It was discouraging." He then recounted seeing an American firebase for the first time through a pair of capture binoculars. They were building it with helicopters. Big helicopters I had never seen before. 47 Chinooks were lifting bulldozers through the air. They built a fort on top of a mountain in 2 days. It would have taken us a year to dig in like that. We saw them bring in pallets of food, water, ammunition. They were not hungry. They had everything. We were like ants trying to build a nest next to the house of a giant. This sense of being an ant fighting a giant was a common theme. My Van On, a former NVA captain, spoke of the psychological weight of American firepower. In a firefight, we were very good. Man to man, we were confident. But the fight was never man to man for long. The fighting would start, and then the noise would come. First, the artillery. It came from nowhere and everywhere. It tore the earth. Then the airplanes. The ground would catch fire. The sky would fall down. We learned to fear the sound of a small plane, the spotter plane, because we knew what came after. It was not a war against soldiers. It was a war against explosions. Even the elite of the North Vietnamese military were shaken. The fighter pilots of the 921st Red Star Fighter Regiment were the cream of the crop, trained in the Soviet Union and China. They flew sophisticated MiG-17 and later MiG-21 jets. One of their top aces, Nguyen Thun, described his first combat sortie over the Red River Delta. "I was trained to fight one enemy, perhaps two. I came up through the clouds, and I saw a sky full of Americans. There were phantoms flying top cover. There were fighter bombers below them. There were tankers refueling them. There were reconnaissance planes. There were rescue helicopters. It was not a squadron. It was a city in the air. We were brave, but we were a drop of water in the ocean. We could shoot one down, maybe two, but there were always more. So many more. Perhaps the most profound shock came to those who were captured. A Viet Cong guerrilla named Tran Van Bo was badly wounded in a firefight and captured by U.S. Marines. He expected to be tortured and killed. Instead, he woke up on a clean cot in a field hospital. A doctor was treating his wound. He was given morphine for the pain and in 4-drip for hydration. In a memoir, he wrote, "I was terrified, but no one hurt me. They gave me water. A young American nurse with blonde hair smiled at me. I could not understand it. My leaders had told us they were monsters, but they were treating my wound with more care than our own doctors could have given to a general. They used things we had never seen. Disposable needles. Clean bandages from paper packets. Later, a soldier gave me a can of something sweet and cold. Coca-Cola. I had never tasted anything like it. In that hospital, I saw the real power of America. It was not in their bombs or their guns. It was in their ability to care for one soldier so much, to have so much medicine, so much food, so much everything, that they could afford to waste it on their enemy. I knew then that we could not win. A country that could be so wasteful could never be defeated by a country that had to count every grain of rice. This was the ultimate psychological weapon. It was not the violence, but the casual abundance. The sight of Americans throwing away half-eaten meals, discarding mountains of brass casings after target practice, using helicopters to deliver mail and beer. Each act of waste was a demonstration of power more demoralizing than a bomb. It told the Vietcong and NVA that they were engaged in a struggle against an opponent for whom the rules of scarcity did not apply. Their entire ideology was built on endurance and sacrifice. They were now facing an enemy who had, through industrial might, almost eliminated the need for either. The turning point, the moment this vast material disparity became strategically undeniable, was the Tet Offensive of January 1968. On paper, it was a brilliant strategic stroke by the North. Over 80,000 Viet Cong and NVA soldiers launched a coordinated wave of surprise attacks against more than 100 cities and towns across South Vietnam, including a daring assault on the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. Giap and the leadership in Hanoi believed this would be their general offensive, general uprising. They thought the attacks would shatter the morale of the American military and inspire the South Vietnamese people to rise up and join them. They were disastrously wrong on both counts. The offensive achieved total tactical surprise. The Viet Cong fought with incredible bravery and tenacity, penetrating deep into urban centers that had previously been considered untouchable sanctuaries. But the uprising never came, and the American response was swift, overwhelming, and utterly devastating. The story of Tet is the story of air mobility and firepower in action. At Khe San, a remote Marine combat base besieged by tens of thousands of NVA troops, the Americans unleashed Operation Niagara. For 77 days, U.S. aircraft flew an average of 300 sorties per day, dropping over 100,000 tons of bombs on the NVA positions surrounding the base, 5 tons of explosives for every single NVA soldier. The base was entirely resupplied by air, with C-130 Hercules transport planes landing under heavy fire to deliver food, ammunition, and reinforcements. In the city of Hue, the former imperial capital, entrenched NVA and Viet Cong units held out for nearly a month. The U.S. Marines and Army units tasked with retaking the city did so block by block, house by house. But their advance was predicated on massive fire support. They used artillery, naval gunfire from ships offshore, and endless air strikes to pulverize enemy positions before the infantry moved in. The ancient city was largely destroyed, but the enemy was rooted out. Everywhere the story was the same. Besieged American units used their radios to call in a storm of fire. Reinforcements arrived by helicopter, landing on rooftops and in city parks. Wounded were evacuated, and supplies were delivered, all while the battles raged. The Tet Offensive was the ultimate test of the two competing systems. The Viet Cong and NVA expended years of stockpiled supplies and threw their best fighters into the battle. They achieved surprise, but they could not sustain the fight. They had no way to resupply their troops under fire, no way to evacuate their wounded, and no answer to American air power. By the end of the offensive, they had suffered a catastrophic military defeat. Their losses were estimated at over 45,000 killed. The Viet Cong infrastructure in the South was effectively crippled, and they would never again be able to mount an offensive on such a scale. While Tet was a political and psychological shock to the American public on the battlefields of Vietnam, it was the final, brutal proof of the material equation. The North Vietnamese had gambled that it could defeat firepower. The gamble failed. After the war, North Vietnamese generals were surprisingly candid in their assessment of their American adversary. They never denigrated the courage of the American soldier, but they spoke with a kind of awe about the machine that supported him. In an interview with an American journalist, one NVA colonel reflected on the conflict. We could defeat your soldiers in a given battle. We could ambush a platoon or overrun a firebase. But we could not defeat your logistics. We could destroy a bridge, and you would have a new one flown in the next day. We could shoot down a helicopter, and there were always 10 more to take its place. We could capture a supply convoy, but it was just a drop from an endless river of supplies. General Giap himself, while always publicly stressing the triumph of the Vietnamese spirit, admitted the staggering challenge posed by American technology. In his memoirs, he analyzed the failure of their conventional offensives. He wrote about the unprecedented quantity of bombs and shells and the great mobility of the helicopter. He tacitly conceded that their strategy had to evolve to avoid direct confrontation, because in any direct, sustained fight, they would be annihilated. Perhaps the most telling concession came from Truong New Tang, the former Vietcong Minister of Justice. After the war, disillusioned with the new regime, he wrote his memoir, a Vietcong memoir. He spoke of the fundamental misunderstanding his side had of the United States. "We did not understand the Americans," he wrote. "We thought they were like the French, colonialists who would grow tired and go home. We never imagined the sheer scale of the resources they would commit. We were told their society was decadent and weak. But we saw the products of that society every day. Their weapons, their food, their medicine. They were fighting a rich man's war. We were fighting a poor man's war. The rich man can afford to lose much more than the poor man." This was the ultimate ideological collapse. The core belief that their spiritual purity and revolutionary zeal would triumph over a decadent, materialistic West was shattered, not by propaganda, but by direct, empirical observation. They saw that the decadent society produced soldiers who were, on average, bigger, healthier, and better equipped than any army in human history. They learned that the materialistic culture had created a logistical system so robust it could sustain a massive, high-technology war for a decade, halfway around the world, without its civilian population ever having to endure rationing or serious privation. The war machine was a product of the very system they despised, and its terrifying efficiency was a daily refutation of their entire worldview. It all comes back to the radio. That green box, crackling with the endless, casual chatter of the American military machine. It was not a tool for predicting the enemy's next move in the jungle. It was a portal that allowed a glimpse into a different dimension of warfare. The voices speaking through that handset were not just coordinating an ambush or a patrol. They were the frontline operators of a global industrial system. The call for artillery was the final link in a chain that began in a steel mill in Pittsburgh. The request for a medevac was the culmination of a medical and aeronautical industry that could produce thousands of complex turbine engines and train thousands of pilots. The mundane chatter about sea rations and ice cream was the audible proof of an agricultural and food processing sector so productive it could feed an army on the other side of the planet with an ease that bordered on contemptuous. The Viet Cong and the NVA did not lose the war to the American soldier. They were, in many ways, the superior fighters in the close-in battles of the jungle. They were masters of their terrain, motivated by a powerful nationalist ideology, and possessed of a courage that stunned their opponents. No, they were defeated by something far more impersonal. They were defeated by the American factory floor. They were defeated by the shipping manifest. They were defeated by the loading dock. They were defeated by the sheer, unblinking, relentless logic of mass production. They were buried under an avalanche of things, an avalanche of bullets, of bombs, of boots, of beans, of helicopters, of radios. The final numbers of the war tell the story in the cold, hard language of industrial output. Over 58,000 Americans died, but the United States military lost over 5,000 helicopters and nearly 4,000 fixed-wing aircraft. They expended 15 million tons of ammunition. The economic cost in direct military spending exceeded $168 billion, the equivalent of over $1 trillion today. The war was not won by either side in a conventional sense, but the American industrial system demonstrated a capacity that was, and is, without historical precedent. It waged war from a position of such overwhelming material superiority that the very concept of a fair fight was rendered meaningless. A former NVA officer, years after the fall of Saigon, was asked by an American historian what the single most terrifying weapon the Americans possessed was. The historian expected him to say the B-52 or napalm or the M16 rifle. The old soldier was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It was the forklift. The American forklift. I saw them in your supply depots. I saw them lift pallets of artillery shells and crates of food as if they were nothing. We used our bodies. You used machines. I knew then. You had a different kind of strength. A strength we could never match." In the end, the most important lesson from the captured radio was not about tactics or strategy. It was about philosophy. It proved that in the brutal calculus of modern conflict, ideology, no matter how pure, and courage, no matter how profound, are ultimately no match for a system that can deliver overwhelming, inexhaustible, and technologically superior force at the touch of a button and the speaking of a word. The hiss of static in that jungle clearing was the sound of an old world of warfare dying, and a new, terrifyingly efficient one being born.